Okay, you can hear me okay? Yeah? All right. So I'm Bob Paquette, I'm one of the full-time faculty, and today we're going to talk about electrical injury and lightning. I like to combine these two topics because although they are both electricity, the physiology and the injury patterns and treatments are actually very, very different. Okay, and it's nice to put them together so you can kind of contrast them in the same lecture. So starting off with man-made industrial electrical injury. So for definitions, high voltage is technically over 1,000 volts. Now that's really more of an engineering definition because medically speaking, you start seeing massive increases in morbidity and mortality over about 600 volts, but technically high voltage is over 1,000. Just as a reminder, household electrical circuits are usually 110 to 220. Obviously, as voltage goes up, the danger, morbidity, mortality, of course, go up. However, a large percentage, in fact, almost a small majority of deaths are actually due to low voltage exposures, and that's largely just due to what people have access to. Most people are not exposed to high voltage situations. As a reminder, voltage equals current times resistance. Medically speaking, the thing that really is important to us is how much current passes through the tissue. That determines how much damage and whatnot. But we never know how much current actually passed through any given patient. And that's why we always talk about voltages. Because our body is essentially the resistor, which is essentially a constant. So as voltage goes up, current will go up proportionately. So that's why we talk about that. As a reminder of how typical man-made electrical injury works, if you were to take a hot wire and put it onto your arm, all right, what's going to happen is our skin is actually a really good resistor. It's a pretty good insulator. So as those electrons are traveling over this high resistance tissue, it's going to generate heat. And very quickly, usually within half a second or so, it's going to burn a hole through our resistor because of that heat buildup. And once a hole is burned through your insulator, all of a sudden it exposes all this salt water, right? Our salty insides, which is a really good conductor. So from that point on, most of the electricity actually dives into the insides. It travels along your muscles, it travels along your vessels, it travels along your nervous system. And as a result, with most man-made industrial electrical injury, the vast majority of injury is going to be on the inside. So whatever burn you see on the outside, that's tiny. Most of the burn is actually on the inside. Other things that depend on how much injury you have, obviously voltage we talked about. Time of contact, obviously. AC versus DC current, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And then path of current. So clearly if the current crosses your heart or crosses your head, the chances of severe morbidity and mortality go up dramatically. There's a quick video here, which is a video of a 50-year-old schizophrenic lady, I believe in Taiwan, who climbed a power line to yell at people, and it didn't go too well. So that would be considered a bad injury. She actually survived that amazingly, but that was 10,000 volts. So another important factor clinically is the effect of water and electricity. We know that if you combine water and electricity, the mortality goes up significantly. And the reason why that is how it affects our insulator, how it affects our skin. So dry, calloused palmar skin, for example, has really high resistance. It's about 100,000 to even 1,000,000 ohms. But you take that same palm and you run it under the water, all of a sudden the ohms drop down to about 1,000. Okay, so you dramatically decrease the resistance by getting skin wet. And because the resistance goes down, you do math, say 120 volts divided by 100,000 comes out to about a milliamp, which will give you a tingling sensation. You take the same 120, but now you divide it by 1,000 ohms, and you get 120 milliamps, which is enough to cause ventricular fibrillation. All right, the difference between AC and DC. They love this on the in-service and on the boards, so we'll talk about this for a second. The difference between AC current and DC current is really a phenomenon at lower voltages. Okay, at high voltage, the difference between AC and DC kind of go away, but at low voltage scenarios, there is an important difference. An AC in low voltage scenarios is about 3 times more dangerous than DC current, and there's 2 main reasons why. The first one is tetany. AC current is a perfect frequency to generate tetany in our muscles. So if you're working on your house and you were to touch a hot line, you may get a tetanic contraction and grab that wire and you can't let go. You just will not be able to. And part of that also is most people's flexors tend to be stronger than their extensors. So not only will you grab it and not be able to let go, you may pull yourself into the wire. With DC current is very different. If you touch a DC current line, you tend to get one big spasmodic contraction, and so people tend to get thrown away from the source, and you don't get that tetany. So that's one reason why AC is worse. Two, the second reason is how AC current affects the myocardium. Because it's alternating current, it's going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. When you put AC current across the myocardium, it tends to cause ventricular fibrillation. DC current is very analogous to what we do with a defibrillator, right? We defibrillate people with essentially DC current, and it causes asystole. And if you were to have an accident, it's actually better in this scenario to go into asystole, because if the pacemaker cells weren't cooked in the process, your heart should be able to restart itself. Conversely, our bodies have no natural mechanism to get out of ventricular fibrillation once it begins. So how do people die? Usually it's cardiac arrest, ventricular fibrillation, or asystole. We talked about the difference between AC and DC, but again, at high voltages, everybody tends to get asystole, whether it's AC or DC current. And another common thing, in high voltage situations, it's very common to get a whole variety of weird arrhythmias. So if someone gets a high voltage exposure, they survive it, and they come to the ED, they might be throwing PVCs, they might have blocks, all that kind of thing. And those people have a significant chance of going into a lethal arrhythmia in a delayed fashion, because they usually have myocardial damage. Conversely, if someone has an electrical exposure and they are in sinus rhythm on arrival at the ED, the chances that they're going to have a delayed degeneration into a lethal arrhythmia is exceedingly rare. Another thing they love to ask about on the boards is dislocations, and classically you can get posterior dislocations both with lightning and man-made electrical injury, and they're missed a lot, right? This is the classic light bulb sign, and it's light bulb sign because your arm is usually internally rotated, and this is important for when you're working in recess and north. You get an altered patient, regardless of why they're altered. You should always arrange their joints and make sure everything moves, because if the patient's laying there like this and they're altered, people have been known to go to the ICU for 3 or 4 weeks with a dislocated shoulder, and nobody ever caught it. Because if you look at the chest x-ray, it's very easy to miss that. Other things, high voltage exposures can cause all kinds of neural problems, altered mental status, seizures, head bleeds, and weird neuropathies. Now rhabdo is a big difference between man-made electrical injury and lightning. Rhabdo is super common with man-made electricity, exceedingly rare with lightning. Now, I think it's obvious why it's so common in man-made electricity. I told you, the electricity dives in, it actually likes to travel along the muscles, and it's going to cook your muscles from the inside. You're going to release a lot of myoglobin, you get the rhabdo. Conversely, compartment syndrome is also very common. This is an example of this. This guy got cooked. This is what he looked like when he came in the ED. All the muscle tissue was dead, so they had to debride all of that. They tried to cover it up, and it didn't work so well. So compartment syndrome, rhabdo, very common with man-made electricity, rare with lightning. And we'll talk about why that is later. So how do you manage this? Most cases you're going to see are going to kind of fall into this category. It's usually somebody working on their house. They get zapped by a line. They're anxious or whatever, and they come running in, and you go, well, what are you having? Well, my finger hurt initially. Well, how does it feel now? It feels fine. Any other symptoms? No. Low voltage exposure, bye-bye. You can go home. All right. If they come in, low voltage exposure, and say, well, my finger still hurts, or my arm feels tingly, or something, you can check a CK, maybe check an EKG. But if that's all it is, those things are negative. You can actually discharge. With high voltage exposures, almost all high voltage exposures pretty universally are going to get admitted at least for observation. It'd be very unusual to have a true high voltage exposure and not have something seriously wrong with you. A couple differences from thermal burns, just to note. Inhalational injury, obviously really uncommon. Inhalational injury is from being entrapped in an enclosed space and forced to breathe poison gas. So unless the electrical injury caused a structure to burn down, you're caught in a burning house or something, inhalational injury doesn't happen with electrical. C-spine, really common, right? High voltage, big muscular contractions, people get thrown. You always have to think about a broken neck. Fluid management is also going to be different from thermal burns. In thermal burns, we do Parkland formula. They get large amounts of volume. Usually we give that in the form of LR. Here, you tend to still give a good amount of fluid, but you're treating for rhabdo. So if someone comes in with a high voltage, you think they're concerned about significant electrical injury, we're going to start treating them empirically for rhabdo. Now, you don't have to use LR. You can. But normal saline is fine, largely just because the total volume that you're going to give is significantly smaller than with severe thermal burns. Other things, one thing I'm going to focus on this slide here is the tetanus. Remember, they also like to ask this in the in-service. Electrical burns are a tetanus-prone wound. And I put it in my mind the same category as thermal burn and frostbite. And all those three things, frostbite, thermal burn, electrical burn, are all tetanus-prone because functionally, at a cellular level, it is a crush injury, right? At a cellular level, you're having crush. So that's why all of those three things are tetanus-prone wounds, and you have to update as necessary. What if they're pregnant? Women who are pregnant who have low voltage exposures usually do quite well, and the fetus does quite well. If they have a low voltage exposure, but the pregnancy is viable, so somewhere over 20 weeks, 22 weeks, whatever, most of those women are going to be sent at least for TOCO. Even if they're asymptomatic, you did your screening thing, they look fine, they'll probably get TOCO. No one really knows what the incidence of abruption is with low voltage electrical exposure, but we do know abruption can happen from relatively minor things. So even if she jumps and lands on her butt or something, that might be what triggers the abruption. All right, lightning. Lightning. I do a lot of wilderness medicine stuff. I've always found lightning very, very fascinating. One of the things I find very interesting about it is 15% mortality. 85% of people struck by lightning live. Now, I told you lots of people die from touching a 110 line or a 220 line in their house, yet getting hit by 30 million volts of electricity, and 85% of the time you'll survive. There's a real important reason for why that's possible. Some lightning myths. Lots of myths around lightning. I suspect some of you believe at least one or two of these. One is metal attracts lightning. You hear people, I've even seen this in the LA Times, like, oh yeah, he got hit by lightning because he was walking around in the storm holding a ladder or something. No, metal does not attract lightning. Now, I will say, I strongly recommend you don't go walking around in a lightning storm with metal. Why not? Why would you not want to be carrying metal in a lightning storm? It does conduct it, and specifically what's going to happen is any metal in contact with your body, if you are struck, is that within about 2 milliseconds going to go to about 1,000 degrees, and you're going to get burned severely. So the metal is not going to increase your probability of being struck, but if you do get struck, you will get burned. So I do a lot of backpacking, and if I get caught in a storm, and that happens sometimes, I put my trekking poles up. I'm not a jewelry guy, but if you had rings or earrings or whatever, you should probably take that off and put it in a pack, because if you have that stuff on, when you get hit, you're going to get burned pretty nasty. Electronic devices attract lightning. This is an older one, and this is going out of vogue. A lot of people don't think about this one anymore. I think it's due to the iPhone. Back in the 70s, I was a little kid, and I was in Massachusetts, a lot of lightning storms. And a storm would roll in, and my grandmother would start turning off all the lights and shut off the TV and the radio. And we'd be sitting in the dark in a thunderstorm. It's like, what are you doing? And she said, well, we don't want to get struck by lightning. It's like, what? I don't understand. She was kind of right. If you're in a house and the house gets struck, what used to happen with a surprising, it wasn't super frequent, but a significant frequency, people would be on a landline talking on a phone that's actually jacked into the wall. If the house gets lit up, that phone cord could light up and electricity could actually shoot out of the receiver into your head. There was a PubMed paper from Australia in the 1980s. Over the decade of the 1980s in Australia, there was about 50 cases of people getting lit up exactly by that mechanism. Now, where my grandmother was wrong is just merely shutting off the TV or whatever doesn't change anything because it's still wired to the house. You'd have to technically go unplug all your electronic devices, and we don't do that. But technically, that current can travel up the lines. Lightning always hits the highest point. Although there's a slight statistical increase of higher points and lower points getting hit, it's very small, and there's thousands and thousands of documentations, like this, where the lightning bolt hit the base of the ground right next to a skyscraper. Why did it not just hit the skyscraper? Lightning is just way too chaotic. You just can't predict it. So it's not a significant risk. It can lightning when it snows out. I don't know if you knew that. I experienced this in Massachusetts in junior high school. It was, and this is usually how it goes, it was late winter storm. It was February, snowing heavy. It was foggy because it's really warm out, and it has to be warm usually for this to happen. Poor visibility. There was a huge explosion. Scared the crap out of us. Our ears were ringing. Had no idea. I thought a plane had crashed or something on the hill. We found out later that night, watching the weather report, that there was several lightning strikes in western Massachusetts. when it does happen, it tends to be associated with these little snowballs called graupel. And graupel is essentially the snow version of hail, right? So hail and graupel and lightning all are due to these big warm updrafts of air. Okay, in the case of lightning, it's ice crystals going up into the high atmosphere. They rub on each other, and that's how the electrical charge is generated. Well, with the snow gets thrown up, it comes down, it gets into a bigger ball, the ball gets thrown up, and the ball keeps getting bigger and bigger until it can't get thrown up anymore and it falls. So if you're skiing somewhere and you start getting pelted with snowballs, you should probably head to the lodge because there's some really bad weather on the way. This is really important. This is a simple one, but this is what a lot of people get fooled by, is that you think you can't get struck by lightning because the sky above you is blue. Lightning travels about 6 miles both in front and behind the storm. It travels laterally about 6 miles. So usually what happens is there'll be a backyard barbecue, everybody's outside, the storm rolls in, everybody goes inside. It rains for 15, 20 minutes, it's storming, and then so the sun comes out, everybody goes, okay, we go right outside, zap. They came out too quickly. There's a lightning bolt that traveled 6 miles backwards and got somebody. So you have to wait long enough because those lightning bolts can be quite long. And then lastly, car tires insulate you and they protect you from lightning. Cars are generally protective in a lightning storm, but it has nothing to do with tires. It's because of the metal roof on a car. All right, so if you're in a metal top, a hard top car, you are sitting in a Faraday cage. You're sitting in a metal box. And so if that metal box gets hit by the lightning bolt, the electrical cage will carry the electricity around you until it can arc into the ground. That's important to remember because if you're in a convertible, even with the top up, it doesn't work because that's not a Faraday cage. So you can be electrocuted in a convertible. So hard top car is protective, has nothing to do with the tires. All right, I told you about lightning formed by these big warm updrafts of humid air. So it tends to happen in the summer, tends to happen in the afternoon, and tends to happen in humid areas. That's one of the reasons why Southern California gets almost no lightning. It's just it's too dry here. The average lightning bolt is about 20 to 30 million volts of electricity. Although it is unidirectional current flow, so it's DC-like, the physicists don't like to call it a direct current because it's so brief. Again, usually only about 2 milliseconds. It literally stops as soon as it begins, so they don't consider it a true current, but it is functionally a direct current. How hot? A lightning bolt is somewhere between 14,000 and 90,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Physicists say that's hotter than the surface of the sun. The only reason why a lightning bolt doesn't actually ignite our atmosphere and burn it off is because it's too brief to do so. But it's really, really hot. And because it's so hot, it leads to a thermoacoustic blast wave. So when that lightning bolt forms, within that fraction of a second, air around the lightning bolt rapidly heats, rapidly expands, and expands so fast, it creates a shock wave. And that's what thunder is rapidly expanding air around that super hot lightning bolt. And the pressure difference around that is quite dramatic, about 20 atmospheres of pressure as that air is expanding. Anvil cloud, by the way, this is a good thing to remember. Backpackers, anybody who goes outside, you see anvil clouds on the horizon, always bad weather. This is big updrafts of humid air, and it goes up to the higher levels, and it kind of flattens out. That's why it looks like a mushroom or an anvil. So you see this is always bad weather. Get to cover if you can. So comparing industrial electrical injury to lightning, what's the difference? It all has to do with timing. I told you that when you put the wire on your skin, it takes a while to burn through your skin. It's not very long. We're talking about maybe half a second or so, but it does take that little bit of time. Lightning is so fast, again, maybe 2 milliseconds, it doesn't actually have time to burn through our insulator. So what ends up happening is you get what is called a flashover phenomenon. So you get hit with these 20 million volts of electrons. It's going so quickly and it lasts so briefly that the electrons literally cascade over your body like shower water. They don't actually pass through your body. And that's the only reason why anybody survives. If, say, 15% of those electrons actually pass through your body, you would puff into steam. There'd be literally nothing left. And in fact, that does not happen. And again, most people, 85% of the time you survive. But that's why. It's because the moment of electrical activity is so brief, the electrons can't actually burn through your skin. When people die from lightning, it's usually cardiopulmonary arrest. And when that happens, usually 2 factors happen. There's an effect on the heart, and there's an effect on your brainstem. So the effect on the heart is essentially like getting defibrillated. You're getting hit with a massive amount of functional direct current, just like a defibrillator. And just like a defibrillator, it's going to cause asystole. Now, I told you the electrons don't actually really pass through the heart, so they don't really damage the myocardium, and so your pacemaker cells are intact. So after about 60 to 90 seconds, your heart starts beating again. Okay, and you got a blood pressure. That's good. That's the good news. The bad news is if you get hit with enough electricity to cause asystole, you also get medullary stunning. And your medulla is responsible for your breathing, so you get central apnea. The problem here is that medullary stunning lasts longer than the asystole. So here it goes. You get hit, your heart stops immediately, asystole, immediately get medullary stunning, central apnea. After about 60 to 90 seconds, your heart is beating, and it's beating, but you're not breathing. And you're not breathing, and you're not breathing, and you're not breathing, and eventually you die a secondary hypoxic cardiac arrest because you're not breathing. The good news about that is these people, despite being in cardiopulmonary arrest, will survive with about 4 or 5 minutes worth of CPR. And as a result, lightning is an exception to the mass casualty rule. Right? So you know in mass casualty situations, what we usually talk about, especially these days, if you're at a concert downtown or something, somebody sets off a bomb, right? Bomb goes off. Let's say 50 people go down. Let's say 4 people are traumatic arrest, pulseless apneic, and then there's maybe 10 people screaming because they got arms and legs blown off and everybody else is walking wounded. If you're a first responder, you black tag those pulseless people, right? The traumatic arrest, there's nothing you can do for them. So you basically ignore them. You go to that next level. You put on tourniquets and whatever and try to control bleeding on that next group of people. Lightning is completely the opposite. And lightning actually does have significant number of cases of mass casualty events, right? You've heard of like golf tournaments and a storm breaks out, right? And people huddle under a tree. The tree gets lit up. 20 people go down. Maybe 3 of those people are pulseless and apneic. Everybody else is breathing. If they're breathing, they're fine. They're probably going to live, so you ignore the breathing ones and you focus on the pulseless apneic ones. Because those pulseless apneic ones, if they get a couple minutes of CPR, they will likely live. Burns. I told you burns, really uncommon with lightning. Very common with industrial electricity, very rare, or not rare, but uncommon with lightning. And when you do get burns with lightning, it's usually minor stuff. About 30% of lightning cases will have some type of burn, and it's usually something like this. And what this is actually a steam burn. Okay, and they're usually minor. It's about 1st or 2nd degree type burns. And what this is from is you're in the rain. You know, you might have some sweat on your skin. Maybe there's some rainwater on your skin. The electrons are cascading over your body. They superheat the water on the surface of your skin, turning it to steam instantly. And that's how you get a steam burn from lightning. It also results in clothes being blown off. And this is one of those things, you know, you hear like, oh, he got struck by lightning and his shoes got blown off and his jacket got blown off. And you think, oh, that sounds like bullshit. No, that's actually true. That actually happens, and that's why it happens, is your body water on the surface of the skin instantly turns to steam, and it will blow your clothes off. And then, of course, the severe burns, which are relatively rare, are metal-related usually. So this guy had some kind of metal chain around here, and again, within 2 milliseconds, it became about 1,000 degrees, and you can get a nice 3rd-degree burn wherever the metal is contacting you. Rhabdo, uncommon, because again, electricity doesn't go through your muscles. It doesn't actually enter your body. Trauma is very common with lightning, right? Because you get these big muscular contractions. People will throw themselves. They will throw themselves into a tree. They will throw themselves off a ridge or whatever. So think about C-spine. Think about other kind of traumatic injuries. Do you know hypotension per se is not caused by the lightning? So if you have a lightning strike victim who's hypotensive, it's because they're bleeding out somewhere. They broke their pelvis, they broke their spleen, whatever. Lightning per se does not actually cause hypotension. Then there's this thing called Lichtenberg figure, which is super cool. It's this fractal patterns people get. This is pathognomonic for lightning. Nothing else does this. And it's thought to be due to they say it's due to some kind of strange vasospasm in the capillary beds of your skin due to the electrons cascading over the skin, which is another way of saying we don't really know why it happens. But this is not a burn. This only lasts about 2 hours, and then it magically disappears. Okay. What are the main problems people have with lightning? It's almost always neurologic in nature. Okay, there are lots of things like this. People will be altered for hours, days, maybe even weeks. Amnesia, enterograde amnesia, super common. Chronic headaches, chronic pain syndromes, weird paresthesias, All of these things, super, super common, somewhere in the 75% range. Something I didn't mention earlier is, and I'll talk about it, I think, in the next slide. I always thought people got struck by lightning like you got beamed in the head. Although that does happen, that's incredibly rare. That's only about 1% of lightning strikes. The vast majority of time when you get hit by lightning, the lightning hits something near you and the electrons wash over you. If you actually do get beamed in the head, you're going to have big cranial burns. So if you had, let's say you were in a mass casualty situation with lightning, and let's say there's 4 people who are pulseless and apneic, and one's got a big smoking head, you probably ignore the smoking head if you have limited CPR abilities, because that person's probably going to die. All right, that's an unusual situation, but the mortality is much higher if you actually get hit directly in the head. Coronal paralysis. This is also common, about 60% of the time. And coronal paralysis is a phenomenon of step voltage. Now, what do I mean by that? As I said, most people don't get hit directly. Usually what happens is the lightning bolt hits the ground. And just because of statistical probability, usually one leg is closer to where the lightning strikes than the other leg. Lightning hits. Millions of electrons are racing towards me, kind of like a wave of water, essentially. They're going across the ground. The ground has high levels of resistance. The electrons don't really like to go across the ground because of that high resistance. When they encounter my legs, because one foot is closer than the other foot, there's a potential difference, a voltage potential difference between my feet. Electricity would actually rather go up and down my legs than across the ground. So if your feet are apart, that's what's going to happen. The electrons are going to approach you, go up this leg, down that leg. And if that happens, you're very likely going to get coronal paralysis. And what that is really profound vasospasm. These people will have pulseless legs. They won't be able to feel their legs. They won't be able to move their legs. It looks horrible. But again, it's one of these things that this will magically go away in about 4 to 6 hours without doing anything. The vasospasm will just release, and they'll usually be okay. They might have horrible paresthesias for the rest of their life, but they'll be able to walk. This concept of step voltage is also why 4-legged animals, such as cows, die at a much higher rate. If you Google lightning strike, there's like thousands of pictures of dead horses and cows, like lots of them. And I tell you, only 15% of humans die. Right. And it's because we stand up. A cow's front legs and his back legs are somewhere between 4 and 6 feet apart. So there's a big voltage potential between their feet. So lots of electricity tends to pass over the body of the cow. Because we're humans, and usually when we get hit, we're standing, and our feet tend to be close together, small voltage potential, relatively little electricity actually goes up into our body. Yeah. That's an interesting point. I haven't actually seen anything like that. That's true. I don't know if you can force them to vasodilate. Yeah, well, that's basically what it is. It's super profound vasospasm. It's just due to this electrical phenomenon. So what are you going to do treatment-wise? Again, if they're pulseless and apneic, CPR for a few minutes, that will save most of these people. Obviously, they're going to be wet and probably cold, so dry them, warm them up. Always think about C-spine. Always do your trauma evaluation. Clearly, you're going to get an EKG. Most of these people will be in sinus rhythm if they're alive on arrival. And if they are, they're very unlikely to have any kind of delayed degeneration. And you don't usually have to worry about things like fluid with lightning because, again, rhabdo is really rare. It's very different from man-made electrical injury. How do you dispo these people? If they have mild to no symptoms, they can actually be sent home. If they have any kind of significant symptoms, they're altered, they're seizing, coronal paralysis, arrhythmias, whatever, they're all going to get admitted to telemetry. But whether they get discharged or whether they stay, they all need referral to a burn center. And the reason why is even if they look really, really good on arrival, most of these people will have some weird neurologic complaint long term. They might have behavioral changes, they might have paresthesias that develop, they might have chronic headache problems, whatever, but burn centers usually handle this sort of thing, so they should be referred. All right, almost done. Prevention. All right, this is kind of important. Some of you might have heard of the 30-30 rule. So the 30-30 rule is 2 parts. One is if you count the seconds between a flash of lightning and the thunder, the flash and the bang, if it's 30 seconds or longer, it's safe to go outside. The idea is that means that the lightning is at least 6 miles away or further away. The problem with that functionally is in most storms there's multiple flashes of light and multiple thunders, and if you don't match them up, it's not going to work. The other part of the 30-30 rule is they usually say you should wait about 30 minutes after a storm passes before going outside. That's probably extra conservative. Probably 20 minutes is fine, but they usually use 30 minutes because if you're in charge of a football game or a golf tournament or something, it's hard to move large numbers of people quickly, so they just use 30 minutes. Remember, a metal-topped car specifically is safe in a storm, or a substantial building. There is no safe place out in the wilderness. All right, so if you're caught outside in a storm, there's just nothing really you can do. It's problematic. The one thing I have done, and I do find effective, and a lot of guides actually don't know about this, is spreading out while you're hiking. So I've been caught, like we got caught in a nasty storm in Wyoming, and so what we did, it was a big open field, and couldn't do much about it. I was in the front, I had my son walk about 70 feet behind me, and I had my wife walk about 70 feet behind him. It's not going to prevent us from getting struck, but what it's going to do is hopefully no more than one of us will get struck. And so you have two rescuers for whoever got burned. The Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts in the group may have heard of the lightning position. This is still sometimes taught. They say you squat down, keep your ears covered, keep your feet together, and stand on an insulator. This is largely crap. There's some good points about it. Which of these things is a good idea? Mumble, 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 mumble. What? What's a good idea? Feet together, right? That one I really like. That actually is smart. At the very least, if you got to stand in the storm, keep your feet together because that will minimize how much electricity passes through your body. How about ducking? I'm 6 feet tall. If I go like this, do you think that lightning bolt that came 7 miles out of the heavens is going to like zoom over my head or something? No, you can't duck under lightning. So don't worry about ducking. That's not going to help. Keeping your ears covered, might that help? Possibly, right? Eardrums rupture. About 50% of lightning strike victims have their eardrums blown out because of that 20 atmosphere pressure change. So if you were going to do something, I suppose covering your ears actually could be protective. And standing on a thin-solite pad, you think that's going to insulate you from 30 million volts of electricity? Yeah, probably not. All right, so if you're going to do something, those would probably be the two best things you could do. And there is one other technique I advocate, and it's supposed to be just as good, and it's the kissing your ass goodbye position. I'm not a yoga guy, but his hand position seems a little suspect. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah, before it basically grounds itself and goes into the water. I don't know the answer to that question, honestly. You know, most lightning, I think it's probably a radius of somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 50 feet is probably, you know, what we're talking about, but I don't know exactly. Anything else? No? All right, cool.